The next U.S. downturn will not be evenly distributed. Local exposures, weak fiscal buffers, industry concentration, and household fragility mean some states will suffer far faster and deeper than the national average. Below, I identified 10 states that, based on fiscal reserves, poverty and debt indicators, employment concentration, housing risks, and recent local shocks, are most exposed to a sharp recession. I explain why each state is vulnerable and point you to the data that underpins the assessment. Key cross-cutting evidence, most important sources: State Rainy Day Fund and Fiscal Health Analysis, Pew-NASBO reviews of 2024-2025 reserves, Household Debt and Delinquency Trends, New York Fed Quarterly, Household Debt and ORD Credit Reports, 2024-2025, National and State Labor Market Data, Bureau of Labor, Statistics State Employment Unemployment Releases and Related Analyses, Poverty and Demographic Stress, U.S. Census Poverty Briefs and State Poverty Breakdowns, Region-Specific Shocks and Reporting, Tourism, Energy, Manufacturing, Local Reporting on Las Vegas Tourism, Louisiana Fiscal Reports, etc. These sources show a simple but dangerous truth. By 2025, many state fiscal cushions had already fallen from record highs. Household and non-mortgage debt rose, and specific industry downturns, tourism, energy, manufacturing, began to depress revenues and employment. Put simply, the U.S. in 2026 would be more fragile than it appeared, and some states would not absorb a major shock. Why it's vulnerable. Louisiana combines a very small rainy day capacity with large structural disadvantages. State documents and fiscal audits show limited reserves relative to expenditures, well below national medians, shrinking GDP in 2025 driven by weakness in energy and petrochemical activity, and very high poverty and household stress in many parishes. When energy prices or drilling activity slumps, tax and royalty revenue slump immediately. Unemployment and public service demand rise in tandem. Recent reports show Louisiana's reserves and budget flexibility are thin enough that a prolonged revenue shock could force sharp cuts. Why it would break. With high poverty, limited rainy day funds, and outsized dependence on volatile energy and shipping revenue, Louisiana could see a cascade of layoffs, declining local tax receipts, and a budget squeeze that forces furloughs and steep service cuts. A rapid fiscal economic downward spiral. Why it's vulnerable. Mississippi ranks among the highest U.S. states for poverty and lowest for per capita income and public service funding. The census and ACS analyses show persistent, elevated poverty rates across the state. Local hospitals and education systems operate with thin margins. State rainy day funds are minimal compared with operating needs. And infrastructure, health, water, roads, is fragile. In a downturn, households with little savings and existing debt burdens will cut spending fast. Local governments that rely on sales and income taxes will quickly face budget shortfalls. Why it would break. The combination of limited state fiscal capacity, high poverty, and failing infrastructure means social costs and out-migration could accelerate, producing a deep, long recovery with rising human distress. Why it's vulnerable. Nevada's economy, particularly Las Vegas, is heavily tourism and hospitality dependent. When convention attendance, airline travel, and big events fall, the state's gaming, hotel, and retail tax receipts decline rapidly. Local reporting documented measurable visitation declines and softening gaming revenue in 2025. Nevada's rainy day capacity is also below the national median, limiting the state's cushion. Tourism declines translate swiftly into payroll reductions across hotels, food and beverage, and transportation, and spill over into small business closures and rising unemployment. Why it would break. A national recession that shrinks discretionary travel or forces cancellations of conventions would immediately reduce state receipts and employment. And with thin reserves, Nevada could face protracted fiscal pain and jobless spikes. Why it's vulnerable. Kentucky's economy includes sizable manufacturing and service elements. While the state improved its rainy day fund in recent years, household poverty and low median incomes remain areas of concern. State revenue growth has been tepid in 2025. Kentucky's reliance on certain cyclical sectors and the existence of many households, one shock away from distress, make it a candidate for rapid demand contraction if layoffs or credit stress hit. State budget reports show limited room for protracted downturns without deeper cuts or tax interventions. Why it would break? If manufacturing orders decline or consumer spending weakens materially, Kentucky families could quickly exhaust buffers and require social services that the state may struggle to fund at current reserve levels. Why it's vulnerable. Small, high-cost states are uniquely exposed when revenues fall. Rhode Island's tax base is relatively narrow and heavily dependent on a handful of sectors, including healthcare and tourism. Pew's reviews flagged states such as Rhode Island among those with relatively small rainy day capacity compared with operating costs. The state also passed budgets reliant on one-time surpluses in 2025, creating future structural gaps. High housing costs and elevated consumer debt make households more fragile. Why it would break. Limited fiscal flexibility, growth-reliant budgets, and a concentrated economy mean that a recession could force an outsized local fiscal crisis and quick spending cuts. Why it's vulnerable. Idaho experienced an extraordinary boom in population and home prices during the pandemic and post-pandemic years. Rapid appreciation left a local market with stretched affordability, rising inventory, and dependence on construction for jobs. By 2025, why it's vulnerable. Arizona saw strong in-migration and housing appreciation over recent years, but housing cost growth outpaced income growth, and the state's elevated share of service, retail, and leisure employment leaves it sensitive to consumer slowdowns. Rising household leverage and high housing cost burdens make rapid reductions in discretionary spending likely in a downturn, with only modest rainy day capacity in some years, and a labor market beginning to show signs of cooling in 2025. Arizona would feel a sharp hit from falling consumer demand. Why it would break. A deep recession would translate into high unemployment for service workers, mortgage strains, and fiscal pressure on states that grew quickly and have stretched infrastructure. Why it's vulnerable. Indiana still relies heavily on manufacturing, particularly autos and heavy industry. Manufacturing is rate and demand sensitive. Reports through 2025 showed early softening in industrial production and capacity use, precursors to layoffs. States with concentrated manufacturing employment face rapid cascades of local job loss and lower household spending, which depresses retail and service sectors. Indiana's rainy day funds are modest relative to potential layoffs. Why it would break. A prolonged contraction in auto or durable goods demand could produce mass layoffs in manufacturing hubs, hitting local tax bases and forcing state fiscal retrenchment. Why it's vulnerable. South Carolina's growth has been accompanied by large increases in housing costs and development. However, median incomes lag, and a large portion of households are cost-burdened. The state's rainy day funds and per-pupil public investment are relatively low, meaning a recession could force reductions in education and public services while unemployment rises in hospitality and construction, both sectors already showing signs of cooling in 2025. Why it would break. Rapid expansion without broad fiscal buffers makes South Carolina prone to sharp corrections in employment and public service provision during a downturn. Why it's vulnerable. Colorado's boom masked widening inequality and high housing costs. Denver and mountain communities saw extraordinary price appreciation, leaving many households highly leveraged. In 2025, pockets of the state faced slowing economic activity in energy, tourism, and outdoor recreation sectors sensitive to both consumer demand and commodity prices, with moderate rainy day balances and large segments of the population spending heavily on housing. An abrupt slowdown could quickly push many households into distress. Why it would break. A triple hit to housing affordability, a slowdown in tourism, energy, and rising delinquencies could create a broader fiscal and consumer confidence collapse if policymakers move too slowly. How these states interact with national dynamics. A few important cross-state dynamics determine whether local stress becomes national. Synchronized shocks. If tourism collapses and manufacturing orders fall and credit tightens simultaneously, the number of states in distress will spike and spillovers will amplify each other. Pew's 2025 review showed that median rainy day capacity fell in 2025, reducing the ability of many states to respond at once. Credit tightening. Rising household and student loan delinquencies, documented in New York Fed and Fed research, will prompt lenders to pull back, cutting small business lines and mortgages at precisely the wrong time. Tight credit converts temporary sales shortfalls into permanent business failures. Labor market lags. BLS and regional Fed surveys in 2025 showed early signs of underemployment and rising long-term unemployment in certain sectors. Those lags mean job losses will continue even after demand begins to recover, making recessions deeper and longer in high-exposure states. What would avert the worst outcomes? Policy and private sector actions can blunt or prevent state collapses. 1. Targeted federal aid or bridge funding to states facing acute drops in receipts, especially tourism and energy states. States with low rainy day funds could be stabilized quickly with conditional time-limited transfers. Pew NASBO data show many states' reserves fell in 2025. Targeted federal bridging would be faster and cheaper than protracted local austerity. 2. Temporary expansions of unemployment and rental support to keep consumption from collapsing in the hardest-hit localities. Evidence from earlier crises shows that preserving household liquidity prevents cascades of business closures. 3. Regulatory attention to non-bank lenders and regional bank exposures to prevent a credit crunch that would lock small businesses out of working capital. The Fed and state banking regulators can pre-position for this. 4. Short-term mortgage forbearance and targeted mortgage modification programs in overbuilt housing markets. These slow foreclosures and stabilize local tax bases. 5. Preemptive fiscal consolidation that protects core services, education, health, safety net, while implementing temporary tax measures only where necessary, rather than across-the-board cuts that worsen recessions. Conclusion: probability, not inevitability. None of the states above is fated to break. But the combination of thinner rainy day funds in 2025, rising household debt, localized industry vulnerabilities, tourism, energy, manufacturing, real estate, and uneven safety nets means these 10 states have a higher probability than most to face acute, self-reinforcing downturns in a severe recession. Policymakers can still blunt the damage with preemptive fiscal and regulatory action, but the window is narrow. If multiple shocks arrive in 2026 while these vulnerabilities remain, the result could be simultaneous state-level fiscal crises that spill up into a deeper national recession.